Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on the Food Safety Modernization Act. I'm Tom Cosgrove, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Knowledge Exchange here at Farm Credit East. A couple technical items before we begin. Everyone's in listen-only mode right now, but if you do have questions, you can type them into the GoToMeeting webinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will collect those during the presentation, and we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. You might want to tap your mouse periodically so your screen doesn't go dark. And I would remind everyone that we are recording of today's webinar is going to be available after the fact at farmcrediteast.com/webinars, where you can also see recordings of previous webinars and upcoming webinars that are scheduled. In November, the Food and Drug Administration released the long-awaited produce safety rules, one of the 7 parts of the regulatory framework under the new law. These laws could have some pretty serious implications for many producers here in the Northeast and across the country. To help producers understand the new produce rule, we're very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Wesley Kline of Rutgers University. You can see some of the highlights of Dr. Kline's bio on the slide. With a bachelor's from Salem College, master's and PhD from Cornell, Dr. Kline has received many awards for his service to New Jersey agriculture. Dr. Kline has previously presented on this topic for Farm Credit East when the current rules were still the proposed rules. Dr. Kline brings a great perspective on this topic, as his appointment at Rutgers is a 100% extension appointment, so he's working with growers all the time on research and helping them be successful. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kline and turn the presentation over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I just want to make sure everyone understands that I don't work for FDA, and I have gone through the 800 pages of materials, but I sure don't understand everything that's in it. So I'm going to give you my perspective, at least at this time. I think where we need to start, though, is to understand where we came from. The original law was passed in 2011 by Congress, and this was bipartisan support. And it's 70 years of changes related to food safety. FDA had very little authority over fresh produce up until this time. And it's really based on prevention of contamination. So it is a major change of the way we handle food in the United States. There are, as Tom said, there are several parts to it. The preventive controls for human food, which is really processing and changes in the good manufacturing processes in the United States. Preventive controls for animal food or feed, and this is the feed manufacturers. This also will impact people who make, for instance, dog treats on a smaller scale. And we have the accreditation of third-party auditors. FDA will be working with auditors to accredit certain ones or certain groups, especially for doing audits internationally and possibly domestically in the future. The Foreign Supplier Verification Program, this is putting the onus on the importers to verify that their suppliers offshore meet the standards that are established in FSMA. And these all have been published or in final form, as is the produce safety rule, which we're going to concentrate on today because this is the one that directly impacts growers in the United States. The other two that have not been published yet are intentional adulteration of food rule and the sanitary transportation rule. These two will be coming out in 2016. So these are the main parts of FSMA, and again, with growers, we're really talking about the final produce safety rule that will impact you. 2 points that I really need to make at the beginning so everyone understands that under FSMA, you do not need to have a written food safety plan, but some records are required. And I'll be talking about what records those are. It's a good idea to have a written plan, but it's not required. Also, this does not replace a third-party audit if your buyer requires it. FDA looks at FSMA as a baseline for food safety at the produce level in the United States. So if you are required to have a third-party audit, you will still be required to have a third-party audit by your buyer. So this will not take the replacement of it. That's very important for everyone to understand. Ideally, sometime in the future, these will merge and it will be one audit or one set of rules. Realistically, that will probably never happen. There's just too many reasons why there will always be someone who will want a third-party audit. So when we look at the key principles for the produce rule, it's really a risk-based on practices and commodities. It's scientific-based, focusing on microbial contamination and the roots of that contamination. It does exclude rarely consumed food or raw food, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It also excludes commercially processed as long as there's documentation for that process. And the reason that's excluded is because that already comes under other rules. There is flexibility for the different sizes of operation, and we'll go into that. And there is a variance that can be applied for, which we'll also discuss that at the end. So these are the main principles for the whole produce rule. We do need to talk about what is a farm. The definition of farm has changed from what was proposed to what's in effect now. It's an established under one management in one general location, but not necessarily contiguous, devoted to growing, harvesting, and raising of crops, animals, including seafood. So you can have more than one farm under one management unit and still considered the primary farm. Also, things like ripening tomatoes, for instance, with ethylene, is also considered under this as part of a farm. And you can pack and label raw commodities as long as you're not doing any additional manufacturing. And for instance, with grapes, for dehydrating grapes for raisins, that would be considered under the farm definition. However, when you do some manipulation of that product, for instance, tomatoes, if you slice them, then that would fall under the preventive control rule if you're doing it for dehydration or something like that. Also, irradiated food would fall under manufacturing. So that's a completely separate set of rules. There's also a secondary level, or what they call secondary activity farm, not located on the primary farm, but it's devoted, it can be harvesting, packing, holding product, as long as the primary farm or a group of primary farmers own 51% of that secondary farm. For instance, a cooperative that may do centralized packing. If the growers own the cooperative, then that would be considered under the farm definition. And this is very important to understand because it's much different than what was in the proposed rule. This is much more flexibility for growers. Also, the definition of what is the size of farm. And this has not changed since the proposed rule except for one factor. It's the average annual value of produce sold. That word produce is very important, and I'll talk about it in future slides. Of greater than $25,000, but not more than $250,000 during the previous 3 years. A small farm is average value of produce sold of $250,000, but not more than $500,000 during the previous 3 years. And obviously, anything over $500,000 is considered a large farm. And we'll be coming back to these definitions and we talk about compliance. What is covered? All commodities that are normally eaten raw are covered. The following is a list of those that are not covered because they're considered that they are not normally eaten raw. Asparagus, all different types of beans, beets, both table beets and sugar beets, sour cherries, collards, sweet corn, cranberries, dill, eggplants, figs, horseradish, hazelnuts, lentils, okra, peppermint, sweet and white potatoes, pumpkins, and winter squash. There are a few other commodities that are on the list, but they're not grown in the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, so I didn't put them on the list. Also, all food grains, wheat, oats, etc., are not covered. Anything that you consume on your farm is not covered, whether it's raw or not raw. And as I said previously, processed products are not covered. So we're really talking about things that are normally eaten raw. Also, average annual value of produce sold during the previous 3 years is less than $25,000. That's based on data that FDA has that they would consider that a backyard gardener or someone has a very small stand out in front of their house. So they are not covered at all by the produce rule. There's also the qualified exemption, or what you may remember is the Tesser Amendment. And there's one very important thing here. It's the average annual monetary value of food sold, not just produce, food sold. In the previous 3 years, is less than $500,000. And it's sold, over 51% of the product is sold to an end user, direct, such as direct to a consumer, direct to a restaurant. And it's within 275 miles of where it's grown. It's very important that food sold, because this includes everything. If you are a grain farmer, that would be considered in the food sold. Even though grain is not covered, that would be made in that calculation of food. FDA cannot change that because that is part of the original legislation. If they could, it would be produce sold, but they cannot change that. So that really impacts a lot more growers than what we would normally expect. There are additional requirements if you meet that exemption. You have to have the name and complete address on a label if, for instance, if you're shipping in boxes, or if it's a tailgate mark at a roadside stand, then you have to have prominently displayed at the point of purchase the name and complete address of the farm. And there is a little bit of other documentation which we'll discuss at the end. The exemption can be withdrawn by FDA for a few reasons. If they have an active investigation and they can trace it back to your operation. If FDA determines it's necessary to protect the public health resulting from conduct or conditions associated with the farm, they can remove the exemption. And there is a process that they do need to go through. FDA would notify or should notify the farm in writing. It's the reason for the withdrawal and the exemption, such as warning letters, a recall, administrative detention, an import detention. And if anyone who's following the food safety situations and warning letters that have been coming out, there have been several. Dairy farms in different states have been getting them, and some other growers have been getting them. The operation would have 15 calendar days when they receive the notification to respond to this withdrawal of exemption. So what happens if you want to get reinstated for the exemption? Well, FDA may reinstate the operation if they determine there was really no issue in their investigation. Also, the operation can request FDA to reinstate the exemption after making the changes to comply. FDA will evaluate the changes, and this needs to be all in writing, obviously, and make a determination if the reinstating is appropriate. There is no time frame for either one of these, so there's no set time, whether it's 15 days or 120 days. There is no set time for either activity. So let's look a little bit at the standard. The parts have not changed from the proposed rule. It's still related to domestic and wild animals, equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation, worker health and hygiene, agricultural water, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about because that's one of the big areas of the changes, growing, harvesting, packing, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and again, that's a place where there's been a lot of changes, so we'll spend more time on that, and also requirements for sprouts. I'm not going to discuss the sprouts because that's a very specialized thing, and it's something that if someone is growing sprouts, they need to look into it very carefully, and I'll give you some information at the end where you can get more information on the sprouts. Agricultural water, and you'll notice it says Subpart E. That means that's part of the final rule, and you can look it up by Subpart E if you want to look just at agricultural water. By definition, water that is intended to or likely to contact the produce of food contact surfaces are considered agricultural water. We're talking about irrigation when applied direct. For instance, if you're using drip irrigation and you're growing tomatoes that are staked or eggplant, it would not be considered agricultural water in this case because it does not touch the final product. However, if you're using drip irrigation and you have carrots, for instance, planted, it would be agricultural water because that water would contact the final product. Also, water used for pest application, growing sprouts, washing or cooling produce, making ice, or prevented dehydration. These would all be considered agricultural water. The other thing that people need to understand that you may use the same water source for something that would be considered agricultural water and something that would not be considered agricultural water. So if you do need to test, you're not talking about double testing. Like I said, it may be exactly the same source. Here's an example. Again, water that has potential or intends to come in direct contact, and that's key. So if you have frost protection, it's not agricultural water if it doesn't contact that harvestable product. For instance, with strawberries, if you have strawberries on the plant and you overhead watering for frost protection, it would be agricultural water. However, if it's blueberries that are not in flower, or even if they are in flower but there's no fruit present, it may not be considered agricultural water. So agricultural water must be microbially safe, and we'll talk a lot more about that. You do need to inspect your water system at the beginning of the season, and this needs to be done annually, and you need to maintain the sources. If the water is not safe, and we'll talk more about what is not safe, you would need to re-inspect the system, make any changes, do water tests, and we'll talk more about that, or treat the water if you don't want to do anything else. And these changes must be done as soon as practical, but not more than 1 year following the following year. Now we're talking about irrigation, we're talking about outside. We'll also talk about post-harvest later. You also, or an authority, can propose alternatives, but they must have the data to back up the alternatives, and they must be submitted to FDA by some regulatory authority within the state, tribe, or country. And we'll talk more about that at the end also. So water quality criteria for direct contact with the crop. All water must meet both of these requirements, have less than 126 colony-forming units of generic E. coli per 100 mils of water for a geometric mean, and less than 410 colony-forming units of generic E. coli per 100 mils of water for a statistical threshold value. These were in the last proposal, and they carried it forward to the final rule. Geometric mean is most frequent occurrence. Statistical threshold value is the variability, the up and down in the samples that you're pulling. FDA will put out guidance documents on how these are calculated. They also are talking about having an online service where you'll be able to punch in your numbers and get your values. The other alternative, if the water contacts the harvestable portion of the crop, risks may be reduced by maximizing time between application and harvest. And in the final rule, they outline a microbial die-off of 0.5 logs per day between the last application and up to 4 days to harvest. This is really important for growers, especially in the Northeast, if you're using surface water applications. If you're using a stream, when you know the variability is very high, this will help you by just reducing when you are applying that last water application. And I'm going to give you an example of why this is so important. This example is the water was tested, had 100 colony-forming units per 100 mils of water. If you calculate your 0.5 log reduction, after 1 day it's down to 330. After 2 days it's down to 106. So you can see very quickly that quality of the die-off of the pathogen is pretty high, which helps you in your calculations. And this same value is used across the United States. So the options is the last irrigation and harvest, the 0.5 log reduction. You have the harvest and end of storage is another option. So you would do a calculation from when you harvest it to how long you have it in storage. And this would be good for crops for long-term storage, such say as cabbage or carrots. The other one is microbial removal rate during activities such as commercial washing. And with all three, you do need to keep records and have the calculations. However, for the harvest to end of storage and for the commercial washing, they do not specify what those values are for die-off. Those you would have to determine. They do not have the data to show those, how it would work. So as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about generic E. coli. Why are we testing just for generic E. coli? Well, it's an indicator of fecal contamination. It is the best thing we have right now across the board to be able to use. It does not tell you exactly if you have salmonella, for instance, as you can see in this slide, or Shigella, but it does give you an indication of fecal contamination. So until we come up with better data, this is what will be used. So the only way to know what really the quality of water is through a testing program, to understand what the quality is, to establish a baseline of water quality, which we'll be talking about in a minute, and really determine if you need to do any type of corrective actions and what those corrective actions will be. So we're going to talk about pre-harvest water first, essentially irrigation water. There are times when you're not required to test. First is when the water comes from a public water system and is used directly, and you can get a copy of the test results from the municipality. However, if you take that water and store it in on the surface, for instance, in a pond, then it's not considered, you have to do sampling at that point, because at that point it's considered surface water. If you use it directly from the main and irrigate with it, it's municipal water, and all you need to do is get a copy of the test. If you put it into a pond, it's considered surface water. And if you treat your water, you do not need to do these calculations. However, and this is right out of the rule, quote, FDA has determined that presently there is no EPA-approved chemical treatment for contaminated water used to irrigate cropland. You notice irrigate cropland. However, there are products registered as sterilizers, and there are antimicrobial products for treating irrigation water systems or irrigation ponds for bacteria and algae. In other words, the pond can be treated for bacteria or algae. The irrigation system can be treated, but you can't irrigate that on the cropland. So to stay within the law, you wouldn't be able to continually inject, for instance, chlorine through your system if that water is going to touch the harvestable product. So how do you establish this baseline for untreated surface water? You'll hear a lot about water quality profile or microbial quality profile in the future, and these are the main terms that are used. The produce safety rule requires a minimum of 20 samples collected as close to harvest as practical over 2 to 4 years to establish your geometric mean and your statistical threshold value. Originally, it was going to be 2 years, but they added 2 more years to it. Also, data sharing among farms is possible, and a third party can collect the data. For instance, if you have a pond or a lake where you have 2 or 3 growers taking out of it, as long as there isn't any reason why one could be contaminated more than the other, then you could share the data. So this gives you an example. You establish your water quality profile taking those 20 samples over 2 to 4 years. Then annually after you sample 5 times, all these are as close to harvest as possible. And you continually add the 5 most recent samples to the 15 most recent samples to continue your water quality profile. If you have a problem, which we've already discussed, you can use the die-off, 0.5 log die-off, and the other ones related to harvest and storage and washing, or you can discontinue use. And these are the options. So if your baseline is higher than the proposed microbial standards, you need to do something. You need to investigate your system to see if there was a problem related to, for instance, manure runoff or wildlife or cross connection for some way, or there may be some problems with the wellhead. You need to take corrective actions. You can treat the water. You can use the die-off, as I already mentioned. Anything else that you could do to reduce that microbial load, and you have 1 year to make those changes. So it's not an immediate thing you need to do. So over the year, you can do it. This is an example of a very typically what you would see, low values through most of the year, and when you get into warm periods of the time in certain years, for instance, in this case it has July and August are high, that's normal. You're getting warmer temperatures. If you're using surface water, you may have more animals around, more animal activity, so you're going to get higher values. But by using the geometric mean and the statistical threshold, these are taken into account. Now, if you're using groundwater source wells, to get your profile, it's 4 times during the growing season over a period of 1 year. You do not have 2 to 4 years to do it. It's 1 year. If the test has no detectable levels of generic E. coli, or if you're under those values of 126 or 410, then you start sampling just once a year. If you have a higher value, then you have to go back testing 4 times. So obviously, if you have a chance to use groundwater sources, you're much better off. When we talk about post-harvest watering, packing houses, or even in the field, you need to have, again, the water test. In this case, it's no detectable generic E. coli in the water. If you have generic E. coli, it cannot be used for post-harvest purposes. You know, whether you're talking about sprouts, whether you're talking about direct contact with the product, making ice, hand washing. If you do have levels that have generic E. coli, then the water is not safe and must be stopped use immediately. And that's the difference between the pre-harvest and the post-harvest. One you have a year, another one you have to stop using it immediately. You also have to have a water change schedule if you're doing recirculated water, such as with dump tanks. And this may be that you just change the water daily, for instance. You have to visually monitor the quality of the water in the dump tanks, flumes, wash tanks, whatever, for buildup of organic material, but it's visual observation. You're not required to treat recirculated water with any type of sanitizer. It may be a good idea for food safety, but it's not required. If you are packing with dump tanks with certain commodities, such as tomatoes, and that's the main one, you do have to monitor the temperature of the water. The reason being, if that water is too cold, you can pull the pathogen that may be in that water directly into the fruit. And ideally, the water should be 10 degrees warmer than the fruit, which is very difficult in the middle of the summer to do. So now I'd like to just move on and talk a little bit about the animal origin amendments. There are many changes in this part which will help growers. The biological soil amendments of animal origin may contaminate, as we know. There are requirements for handling, conveying, and storing, and treatments, and we're going to go into these methods. Also, an alternative can be proposed, again, as long as it's from a legal authority within the state, tribe, or country that deal with food safety. So untreated soil amendments. They're considered the highest risk, of course, because there's potential for pathogens to be there. All the following are considered untreated. Raw manure, obviously. Aged or stacked manure is considered untreated. Slurries, compost teas that are used with raw manure, any soil amendments that mix with raw manure, and table waste. Table waste was added, and this is the reason that if someone is sick, for instance, with a foodborne illness, and that product leftovers is taken and put on the land, it may contaminate the soil. Composting is a way that you can use raw manure if it's composted properly. Again, composting is controlled, and that's very key. Biological process that decomposes organic matter and reduces pathogens. Temperature is the primary method. Only approved scientific valid composting process ensures the die-off, and there is some record keeping is required, and I will discuss about that in a minute. In the final rule, there are two methods that are listed as scientifically approved. The static pile composting, where air is injected into it. You do need to get up to a minimum of 131 degrees for 3 days, followed by a curing process. And that curing process, in the proposed rule, they had said it needed to be covered. That is not in the final rule. Also, the turn composting system can be used, where again the temperature gets up to 131 degrees and for 15 days. That doesn't mean you have to turn it for 5 times. That does not mean you have to turn it 5 days in a row. It can be spread over. They do not need to be contiguous turning times. Other methods may be used if, again, you can prove scientifically that they're valid. FDA continues to encourage growers to use the organic standards of 90 days if the product does not touch the finished product. We're talking about raw manure, and 120 days if it's going to contact the edible portion, and this is prior to harvest. FDA is spending a lot of money with grants looking at raw manure, trying to make decisions on how these should be adjusted, and it's probably going to be, they estimate, 5 to 10 years before they do have a final ruling on raw manure. So until that happens, the National Organic Standards is what's going to be encouraged to be used. If the manure has been composted and handled properly, then the application time is 0 days. They also encourage you not to come in contact with final product if at all possible. Agricultural teas is an area that there's a lot of discussion about. If animal origin is used, in other words manure, it must be considered untreated unless you have water that has no detectable E. coli present and it's composted, has gone through the composting process and it's finished. then in that case it's 0 days to harvest. However, if you take that same product and you add to it molasses, sea kelp, or any other product as an additive, then it's considered the same as raw manure. So then you could not use it directly on a finished product. If the tea is made entirely of vegetative materials, however, then it's not even part of the rule, and you can apply it at any time that you want. There is some record keeping with this section. If you are purchasing your compost from a third party, you need to annually get a certificate of analysis or some documentation of how they're doing the process. And that's what you would maintain. It's just that copy of the information. If you're doing on-farm composting, then you need to have the temperature, the turning, how many times you turn it, when you did it as your records. As far as storing, this is pretty much common sense. Anything you can do to minimize runoff, the leaching, wind drifting or moving the product. You may want to consider covering the pile. It's not required. Building a berm around to reduce runoff, which I do have growers who are doing that now. Not storing it up a hill from where your produce is, or finished compost, not close to a water source, making sure that raw manure and finished compost don't come in contact with each other. As far as worker safety is concerned, we know that humans carry pathogens, whether it's Shigella, whether it's norovirus, E. coli, etc. We also know that they can spread these through the fecal-oral route. That's the main way we get contamination with workers. So there is requirements for proper hand washing and talking about injuries to hands, or injuries, and we'll talk more about that. Everyone on the farm must be trained, and that includes everyone from someone who may be in an office through all the field people. If you have volunteers, if you have interns, they must be trained. Family members must be trained. And this must be done annually, and you have to have documentation that it was done. You also have to do it in a language that's easily understood, whether it's by written or by pictures, but it has to be easily understood by everyone. The type of thing that should be included in the training is proper use of toilets and hand washing, cleanliness. What if someone gets sick? What if there's an emergency? How you communicate those risks to managers and supervisors. We're talking about food handlers in all of these cases, and everyone needs to understand that that person who cuts that head of lettuce, for instance, may be the last person to touch that head of lettuce until it's consumed. So we're really talking about food handlers. Proper hand washing needs to be stressed. One thing FDA did in the final rule, they have added that you can use hand dryers, in other words, air dryers. In the original proposal, that was not included. Towels were, but now it has to be either a disposable type of towel or hand dryer. So, and also, it's still, you cannot use hand sanitizer in place of hand washing, in place of soap or other detergent. There's a few other issues that are in the final rule. Everyone except for the personnel that you've already trained is considered a visitor. They must be aware of the policies on the farm. They must have access for toilets and hand washing facilities. Now, this can be done with signage. It does not mean you have to have something if someone comes on the farm and you have them sign a form. But you need to have obvious signage telling visitors what they can do and where the toilets are, where the wash stations are. Jewelry is also new in the final rule. Jewelry must be covered or removed when it cannot adequately be cleaned and sanitized during when you're handling produce. This is new in the final rule. So a jewelry policy, you would need to have gloves, for instance, or some way you're going to clean and sanitize those, which is going to be very difficult if they have jewelry on. Also added to the final rule, no eating, chewing, or using tobacco products in the area where you're harvesting, for instance, covered activities or covered products. So we're talking about eating, we're talking about chewing, we're talking about using tobacco, we're talking about spitting. Water is acceptable because we do not want people to dehydrate, but that is about the only thing that would be acceptable. You do need to have, again, this is nothing new, toilets, toilet paper, soap, clean water. In this case, it's microbially safe water. The paper towels or hand dryers, some places dispose of those, first aid kits, and some break area for the workers. For the training, you need to have a record that you did the training. It can be a very simple form with the date, who did it, material that was covered, the names of the individuals, and the person who did the training. Any records that you keep, you need to have the responsible person for your food safety to sign it, date it, and sign it. Even if someone else did the training, they both can sign it, but you need to have that food safety person definitely sign the documents. I'm going to talk just shortly about the equipment, tools, and buildings. The equipment tools that need to be designed and constructed to allow adequate cleaning and maintenance. Food contact surfaces or equipment tools must be inspected, maintained, cleaned, and sanitized as necessary. And you notice it's not saying you need to do it daily or you need to do it every hour. It's as necessary. And a lot of these things are based on risk assessments, which the individual grower needs to do. Buildings must be designed, constructed to allow adequate cleaning and reduce potential for contamination. This does not mean that you need to have a completely enclosed building. This does not mean you necessarily need to have a cement floor. This means that you can clean it and reduce potential for contamination. Must have adequate, reasonably accessible toilet and hand washing facilities in or adjacent to the building. So you can have a hand washing station just outside your packing area, for instance, a toilet and hand washing station. You don't need to have it inside if it doesn't fit into your operation. So you can have an open packing house or a closed packing house. It's whatever, again, whatever fits best into your operation. You do need to be able to keep things clean, as I mentioned, especially during the post-harvest handling to reduce the risk, potential for contamination. And we're talking about everything from the packing containers, again, the equipment, hands and clothing, the water, which we talked about, the building, the coolers especially, and the vehicles. Again, most of these are observation on your part. When we get into animals, and wild or domestic animals, FDA is really looking for fecal material, not necessarily just for signs of animals. And if you have working animals are used for planting, harvesting periods, then you need to have a system that you know that you're reducing the chance, again, of contamination on the produce. Need to monitor for animal intrusion. And if it's observed, you need to evaluate whether you can harvest the product or not. And some of it depends on whether it's above or below ground, but it's visual observation. There are no records required to be maintained for this purpose. So how do you assess for wildlife activity? Well, do you find wildlife feces in your produce fields? How often? How widespread is it? is it in contact with the produce? For instance, if you have geese, migratory geese, and you have a spinach field, they may concentrate in one area in the spinach field and not bother the rest of the field. That's what you need to determine. Is your farm in an area that has a large number of animals? I just mentioned about the migratory birds, the geese, herds of deer, certain times of the year can be a problem. What can you do to reduce the contamination? Is it, for instance, if you have a pond, fencing off the pond, does that help? Is it a matter of scaring them out? Are there noisemakers you can use? What you can use to manage that population? During the growing season, as I said, you need to monitor for feces and evidence of intrusion. Evaluate the risk to the crop. If it's a tree crop, it may not be a problem. If it's a root crop and you have wild pigs, for instance, it's a problem. Consider past observations. What happened the year before? Is this normal, what's going on? Or is this just something that happened once? Also, you need to evaluate it prior to harvest, immediately prior to harvest. So during the growing season is one time, immediately prior to harvest is another time. Scout, look for fecal contamination, signs of activity, assess the risk, decide if the crop or the portion of the crop can be safely harvested. Or do you need to flag that part off and not harvest it at all? Working animals, you need to decide how the working animals can be used, set up patterns of maybe where they walk, train especially the people who are working with the animals that they're not touching the produce without washing their hands. Have a standard operating procedure or instructions on what happens if there is manure in the field, how that will be handled, how you will sanitize the tools if you pick up that manure or bury the manure. So you need to have a set procedure when you're working with animals when you're getting close to harvest, especially anything that's going to come in contact with the finished harvestable product. What about domestic animals? Some questions are domestic animals allowed in the field while the crop is present as part of the production process? Again, this is the use of, for instance, horses. Is runoff likely to flow from pastures, corrals, or manure storage location into production fields? We've had situations where when we're doing testing to collect some data, we have situations where runoff has come from a pasture into a spinach field because of heavy rains. I have some growers who have actually built berms around some of their fields so the water will flow from the pasture area down into a woods to keep it out of the production area. Is pets' access to the fields and packing areas controlled? This is an ongoing issue, especially with cats and someone's favorite dog, but you have to think about that. And I'm going to address this a little bit more, I believe, in the next slide. Are workers aware of cross-contamination risks from fecal contamination? And this is whether it's wild or domestic animals. This is one of the training things you really need to emphasize, especially if you have a dairy operation or a beef, cattle, hog operation on the same farm where you're doing produce. Do animals graze culls or crop residues in the field? And is the production ground rotated into grazing land? FDA has not set a time frame from when you graze a field to when you go into production. Probably logically would make sense to use the same thing as used for raw manure, but they do not stipulate that in the final rule. We know animals can be a problem because they carry a lot of pathogens that affect humans, such as O15787, which has been a continual issue, salmonella, especially with birds, migratory birds, listeria, and we know they can be spread by fecal material, which I already talked about. And as I said before, you can use fences. You're not going to exclude all animals. We know that. You're not going to eliminate all birds or small animals. That is not what's being proposed. That was never proposed. You have to figure out in your individual farm how you live with the wildlife and domestic animals you have around you, and how that's going to impact your final product. Pets, as I said before, can be a special case because everyone has their favorite dog that rides with them in the truck. And they go everywhere. They go in the field. They go in the packing house. You really need to think about how you can control where they go, especially dogs, for instance. The other issue that's come up recently in New Jersey is related to U-pick operations and service dogs. Are service dogs allowed, for instance, strawberries? You have a U-pick operation. You have people come out and they bring a service dog with them. Is that acceptable or not? This is something we need to get better defined. So let's talk a little bit about growing, harvesting, packing. There must be a food contact sanitation step between covered and excluded produce during packing if the covered production steps are not followed. In other words, if you're packing, say, potatoes or eggplant and you're going to pack lettuce, if you're not following the same procedures, then you need to have a sanitation step between them if you're doing it on a packing line. So that's something that was in the proposed rule and is still in the final rule. You can't distribute a product that falls on the ground before harvest unless it's normally done that way, or if it's going to be commercially processed. A normal production practice for almonds, for instance, is to shake the trees, and they fall on the ground. In that case, that's acceptable. But with apples, it would not be. Also, any sanitizer or disinfectant used must have an EPA pesticide label. This is an ongoing issue related to some products that are used as sanitizers or disinfectants in a packing house. If it does not have an EPA label, it is an illegal application. I would encourage growers to, if they have a product they're using, go online and look for supplemental labels. There are products that you would normally think did not have a label because you can't find it on it, but there's a supplement label. And some of those labels are 25, 28 pages long, and it's right at the very end, it will say about using directly on fruits and vegetables. And chlorine is one of those examples. Food packing material needs to be cleanable, and that's their word, or designed for single use. And it has to be so it's unlikely to support growth or transfer bacteria. By FDA's final rule, food containers are acceptable, canvas bags are acceptable as long as they are clean or they have liners that can be replaced. We all know, or should know, that food containers or wood cannot be sanitized. But as long as you can put a liner in it or you can clean it, visibly clean, and it's acceptable by USDA standards. Records, compliance, and enforcement. There are some records that need to be maintained. Example is the agricultural water testing results and those conformancy reports from if you're getting your compost from a supplier. Records do not need to be duplicated. If you're using them for some other purpose, that's fine, as long as you have access to them. They can be computer records also. They don't need necessarily be handwritten. However, if they're handwritten, it must be done in ink. This was added to the final rule, and the rationale is that if you use pencil, someone can always erase it and change the date or what the log said. So the handwritten must be in ink. All records must be kept for at least 2 years. And in case of the qualified exemption, if you're trying to get that qualified exemption for under $500,000, you need to keep the records for at least 3 years because you need those to show 3 years back that you qualified for that exemption. Also, as far as enforcement, FDA has authority to shut down a farm if they're producing adulterated product. And this is true whether you're over $25,000 or under $25,000. FDA does have the authority to do that. Talk a little bit about the variance that is provided. A state, tribe, or foreign country may petition FDA for a variance for one or more provisions if deemed necessary in light of local growing conditions. However, practice under the variance would need to provide the same level of public health protection as the proposed rule or the final rule without increasing the risk of adulteration. And that must be submitted by a person or organization that has regulatory authority for food safety within that state, tribe, or foreign government. So it's not something that a grower is going to be able to just do. They're going to have someone within that state support it with scientific data, and that organization will need to submit it. This is a change from the proposal because there were variances in the proposal where you would able to do something and keep your data to show it if FDA did an audit. That's not true under the final rule. Here's some examples of variances. Agricultural water microbial quality criteria, the microbial die-off calculations, and frequency of water testing. Those are just some examples that FDA would accept if you can come up with, again, scientific data and submitted by an approved authority within that state. Now let's talk about compliance states. Very small farms, again, average annual value of produce sold over $25,000, but not more than $250,000. You have 4 years from the effective date, which in reality is about the 1st of January 2016, because the final rule has been published in the Federal Registry. So we're looking at from about the, say, January 15th of 2016, you have 4 years to comply with the rule. Small farms, $250,000, but not more than $500,000, have 3 years to comply. All other farms that are covered have 2 years to comply. In addition, compliance dates for water standards, testing, and record keeping have 2 additional years. So with very small farms, you would have 6 years for that portion, for the water portion. Small farms would have 5 years, and other farms would have 4 years to comply. So FDA is really giving you a lot of time to be able to comply with these regulations. Also, with the qualified exemption, as far as record keeping, if you're trying to get this qualified exemption eligibility, you need to start keeping records the 1st of January, because you need 3 years, or at least either 1st of January 2016, 1st of January 2017, you need 3 years worth of records to show that you would comply with the qualified exemption. Now, the labeling requirement doesn't go into effect until January of 2020. However, if you're in the wholesale trade, there is a law that's been in the book since 2002, which is the Bioterrorism Act, did require all boxes to have the name and address of the producer on the box. In reality, this has not been enforced to a very great extent, especially for small growers, but it is on the books. This just gives you a schematic of what we're talking about as far as time frame. So we're looking at the effective date, which is 60 days after the final rule was published. It was published in November. So it's about the end of December, the 1st of January, 2015, 2016. Large grower would have till the end of 2017, the 1st of 2018. Small grower would have at the end of 2018 or the beginning of 2019. Very small grower at the end of 2019 or 2020. Then you had 2 more years of each of those. In reality, this rule will not be completely in effect until 2021, unless there's congressional action for some reason. So we're talking about 2020 2020-2021 before this final rule really goes into effect. One more thing is that everyone will have to have at least one person on their farm to be trained. This training must be an approved training course by FDA. There will be training courses starting in January of 2016, and I'm sure over the next several years there'll be trainings every year. These trainings will be done in local areas. I know in New Jersey we have 3 scheduled right now for 2016, and I'm sure each state will have some more regionally. There will be trainings. And this will be, as I said, a certified training that has to be recognized by FDA, and then there will be some refreshers, but mainly this is the basic training. It is a full day training, so you would expect between 6 and 7 hours of training. There's a lot of information available on the web from FDA. The first website there is the basic one for FSMA. The other 2 are guidance documents related to the produce rule. FDA has really tried to go out of their way to provide information for growers and the industry. They also are very interested in having education take place before there is any enforcement. They will be providing training for, or money for training to several sources. There are 2 alliances that are mainly spearheading this. One is the Produce Safety Alliance, and the website is there. You can get a lot of information there. You can actually sign up and they'll send you on a regular basis information. The Preventive Controls Rule, which again is the processing rule, and Sprouts, if you go to the website listed there, which is the Illinois Institute of Technology, they're heading up that alliance. So these 2 sources will be providing the training initially. Also, FDA are writing guidance documents for many of these things, and they will be coming out over the next year or so. FDA also is collaborating with a lot of the either state departments of agriculture or state departments of health, depending who has the food safety authority in that state, to develop materials and provide training and also research. So FDA is going to rely heavily on local state individuals, and hopefully we'll be funding those to adequately provide the service that is really going to be needed. That's the end of my presentation. If there's any questions, I'll try to entertain them. Turn it back over to you.
Great, Dr. Kline, thanks so much. You obviously covered a lot of ground there. So just a reminder to everyone on the call, so if you have a question, on the right-hand side, or on your screen, you should have a panel where you can type that in either under questions or under the chat, and we'll pass those on to Dr. Kline for his responses. And I would mention that in addition to the recording being at farmcrediteast.com/webinars, a PDF of the slides themselves will also be posted. So in terms of referring back, I wanted to mention that too. So while people are pulling their questions together, Dr. Kline, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the role of the states and the state departments of agriculture or the state departments of health in sort of rolling out the implementation of this law. In terms of the actual enforcement, you mentioned it in regards to materials and training, but I mean, is it going to be the states themselves, or would it be, if someone was, say, going to visit your farm, is it going to be someone from the FDA?
That's a good question, because I think some of this is not completely worked out yet. There's a lot of discussion among state and the federal level about how this will be handled. There will be FDA inspections. However, I don't expect anything very serious, shall we say, for many years. FDA does not have sufficient individuals trained to be able to do the enforcement, and they're really pushing the education. They want to bring growers along. They're not interested in going out and doing enforcement right away. Obviously, if there was a foodborne illness outbreak, then that's completely different. But for normal purposes, they want to encourage the education and working with, again, state departments of agriculture and health, depending on who has the authority. They are also talking to them about what enforcement role they may have, but this is not finalized yet.
Okay, good to know. And as I was asking that question, several of our the participants were asking something similar. One of the questions that came in brings up kind of another aspect of this, which is some of the things you talked about relative to, I think with preventing animal contact to produce and things like that, where it's really on the farm itself to kind of monitor. What are the best practices there? Because in some of these cases there's not an actual like threshold level like there is with the water testing. What should farms be thinking in terms of compliance on rules like that?
Well, I think one thing a grower needs to understand is that this is very much risk-based, and each farm is an individual, different, and they need to assess their farm as far as what is the risk of, for instance, where the animals are located in relation to a leafy green field, where the manure is stored in relation to a leafy green field. So it's very much risk-based and assessing the risk. The things that are important in food safety are the animal activity, as I mentioned, the worker hygiene, which is a huge issue, proper hand washing, frequency of hand washing, the manure, again, where it's stored, how it's used. Those are the real big things that we're concerned about.
But on things like that, should the farm try to keep a record, or because there may not be an official way to, say take a measurement like you can do with a water test?
No, that's right, and FDA has tried to reduce the onus on a grower as much as possible as far as record keeping. And in many of these things, in reality, we do not have the data to support record keeping anyway. I think what I'd do if I was a grower, I would, again, look at my operation. What I tell growers when I do food safety training is, go out in the center of that field, look to see what's around that field. What's the potential for something running into that field that may contaminate my crop? What's the chance of wildlife coming in from a certain area that may contaminate that crop? Again, it's very much a risk-based on that farm. And yeah, you can write this stuff down, which makes sense, but FDA is not requiring it.
Okay, good. Question came in again on the same topic of inspections and compliance relative to large farms, and I think the nature of the question here is, how's that going to vary? Obviously, the different thresholds in terms of the time frame by which you have to be in compliance, but is there going to be a different time frame in terms of when inspections might occur? I think it really gets to what are the differences between compliance for small farms versus large farms?
The only difference in compliance is when it starts to kick into effect. Large farms is 2 years, smaller farms is either 3 or 4 years. That's really the only difference. There is no difference as far as enforcement is concerned. There is no difference in what is required. Now, not saying that FDA may want to do an inspection on someone's farm because they're in that large group and they have to start complying earlier on, or they may want to come and sample something. For instance, this is not a part of FSMA, but FDA does sampling every year of certain commodities. They're going to be doing peppers this coming year, I think, and they're going to do another or 2 crops. They do this every year routinely. This is not part of FSMA, it's part of their sampling program. So you may see that.
Okay, good. Question came in that you said one of the new things that came in the final rule was about jewelry. And does it apply only to hands? They're asking about visible jewelry, and I think they're thinking about like piercings, like a pierced ear or something like that. Would that need to be covered? Or is the regulation say?
It would only be on jewelry that could come in direct contact with the final product. So I guess the way I would look at it, and honestly would have to look to see if it specifies in the rule, but rings, for instance, hands, or maybe even watches, but things that would come in direct contact with that final product.
I got you. Okay, great. A question came in about, are there separate rules for hydroponically grown produce in greenhouses?
No, there's not. And that is actually, I forgot to mention that, that's spelled out in the rule that they're considered the same, especially for the water issue.
Okay, so would there be any specific considerations a hydroponic grower should take into account as they're looking to comply?
The biggest thing is the water testing. They're still going to have to develop that water profile, microbial profile for water. Everything else, you're in an enclosed structure, so you're talking about the worker hygiene issue and the water are probably the two big things.
Okay. Question came in from a direct marketing operation about dealing with the hand washing requirement relative to portable toilet facilities. So they have, they're trying to provide the facilities with signage, but then you get people who say aren't worried and may not comply, with the requirements to use those facilities. I guess what's the obligation of the producer in that case?
Well, there needs to be some practicality in this. In reality, there's not a whole lot you can do. You can encourage people to wash their hands, but you're sure not going to want to turn your customers off either. So the best thing you can do is encourage them with signage and encourage them maybe with funny signs. It doesn't have to be you have to wash your hands, but use drawings and things if you can to encourage them to wash their hands.
Sure. Okay. So a question came in relative to the qualified exemption. For a farm that's small enough to meet that, what would then the requirements be following them receiving the qualified exemption?
As long as they keep their records on showing that they can meet the qualified exemption. In that case, it's receipts, it's invoices, it's whatever they have to show that they producing under that a dollar amount, and it's 51% of it's sold retail. Their only requirements are labeling. In other words, if they sell a box, ship in a box to someone, have the name, address on that box, that they have, if it's a roadside stand, then they need to have a sign with their name and address on. Those are the main requirements.
Okay. A specific question came in on produce boxes, like wax boxes, for example. Can they be reused? And I think the application they're thinking of here is with a CSA, Community Supported Ag, where you've got, say a weekly delivery to the subscribers, which are then sometimes reused week after week. Or is a wax box like that, by its definition, single use?
Good question. And if that box is clean, or you can put a liner in it that can be taken out by the proposed rule, or by the final rule, excuse me, that I read, then it would be acceptable for reuse.
Okay. Thanks. The question came in terms of the cost of the inspections. I'm inferring here that they're talking about, I don't know if there would be actually a cost when there is an inspection, or if they're talking about in general, who's sort of covering the bill for the inspectors. But I'd be interested in your comment on kind of both of those.
My understanding at the present time, and I think it's written into the rule, but again, I'd have to check, that there would not be a charge. I believe Congress wrote that in specifically, FDA has gone back to Congress several times, asked them for additional funding related to food safety, and Congress has provided some. But I think at this point in time, Congress is very insistent that it not be a charge to the produce industry.
And what about, I was at a meeting last year, the Northeast Association of State Departments of Agriculture, NIASDA, and the Northeast Ag Commissioners were concerned about this topic in general. I think, you know, is there, and this may be beyond the scope of your presentation, but in terms of the state level enforcement, I mean, is funding going to be provided to them?
Yeah, and that's a good question. That's some of the negotiations that are going on between Food and Drug Administration and the states right now. How much funding will be made available, and I know some states have made it very clear, well, if we don't get funding, we're not going to be involved. So that's going to be an ongoing discussion.
Okay. Question came in relative to the definition of a retail food establishment. I think the specific example they're talking about here is, say, like a food co-op that sells to the public, or potentially like a network that might be collecting and distributing produce. I guess the question is, you know, where in the framework would they be covered?
Okay, my understanding of the rule is that if an individual grower provides or sells directly to a store, directly to a restaurant, that is considered retail by definition. However, if that same individual goes through a third party, such as another buyer or a broker, that would be considered wholesale.
Okay. Okay. And question came in relative to workers, and this one talks about, sort of, it gets to that issue of accessibility of facilities. For example, if the worker housing is, say, 100 yards from the packing house, does that meet the standard of it being readily accessible? I mean, obviously you may not know the specific answer, but what are your thoughts on that type of an issue?
Okay, and I have some of those situations where the migrant housing is where they eat, which is acceptable. The migrant housing may be where the facilities are. The problem is, and this is a little bit off of what FSMA, but a problem is if you expect or require your workers to wash their hands, you have no ability to see that they are washing their hands. I would strongly recommend, and this again, it's over and above what FSMA says, I would strongly recommend that you have a hand washing facility either in the packing house or right outside the packing house where you have the ability to see that people are washing their hands.
Okay. Getting back to the qualified exemption issue, question came in about purchasing produce in from another grower for resale, and how would that impact the standard under the qualified exemption?
If it's your farm and say you have a roadside stand, which I assume that's what you're referring to, you're purchasing from someone else. You know, it's what you're growing, and it's what that person's growing. If they're delivering to you, that would be part of the exemption. If you're growing and putting on your stand, that would be part of the exemption. The facility itself or the roadside stand isn't part of it. It's where that's grown and where it's delivered to. Okay,
great. Well, Dr. Kline, we've kind of gone through the list of questions that have come in, so I think we're going to wrap it up. Again, we really appreciate your expertise in terms of helping folks understand how these rules may roll out. I want to remind everyone that we are going to be posting a recording of this and the slides. I also want to mention that we've got a upcoming webinar on December 17th regarding grain marketing and risk management. But again, like all of our webinars, they're available at farmcrediteast.com/webinars. Dr. Kline, any final thoughts you want to offer before we sign off?
I guess the last thing is I make sure that everyone understands, especially for the wholesale growers, that if you're required to have a third-party audit, that is completely different than FSMA. Requirements probably are going to be different than FSMA, but you do have to meet the minimum requirements for FSMA, but your third-party audit normally is above what's required. So don't get confused and think that I'm complying with FSMA, so that's all I need to do. You'll quickly find that your buyers are going to tell you something different. So it's very important that wholesale growers understand that difference.
Okay, great. Well, again, we appreciate the information, and we appreciate everyone joining us here today. And with that, we will sign off.